I'm preaching a message this morning I've entitled Released and Delivered. Released and Delivered. Now, those among us who are parents, no doubt out of a love and devotion for our children, desire the best for them, right? We want what's best for them. And so we're eager to see them grow. We're eager to see them develop. We're eager to see them mature and press forward. And in whatever endeavors they pursue in life, that they would be successful and, Lord willing, prosperous. Because we have this heart for our children, it's why we see things like my third grader is an honor roll student on the back of people's vehicles, right? Because we have this heart for children and our own children, it's why we spend tens of thousands of dollars on sports teams and select teams and music lessons and special tutors, because we want our children to have maybe opportunities we didn't have. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not so healthy, right? I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a mom and dad who have just launched their son out of their home into the big world. And they're watching and they're waiting to see if he rises on his wings and moves into success and prosperity. This is a true story about a mom and dad who sent their son off, as many moms and dads have, into the military. He immediately, as he joins the military, begins to outdistance himself from his fellow soldiers. Mentally, he has the acumen to grasp the concepts of warfare and the battlefield and the nuances of the art of war. But not only did he possess greater mental faculties, he was also ahead of the ranks with regard to the physical aspects of soldiering. He was a natural-born leader. He was the type of man that other men wanted to follow. So much so that it was obvious to his commanding officers and those who were in authority over him that this man was destined to do great things. Well, the test finally came, and sure enough, he was tested on the battlefield, and he passed those tests with incredible courage and bravery as he fought and he prevailed and he led others to do the same. Because of his skill, because of his bravery, because of his courage, he quickly began to move up in the ranks, and he became actually a commander of a large battalion of soldiers. And others began to take notice of his ability and his skill with people, so much so that he moved out of leadership not just in the military, but moved into more political areas of leadership, eventually rising to a position where he had authority and he had power over hundreds of thousands of people. Now, I want you to put yourself in his parents' shoes this morning. Would you have a sense of pride over your son's meteoric rise to prominence and position? No doubt, moms, you'd have a scrapbook with all of the newspaper clippings and magazine articles about his rise to power. You'd post things on your Facebook wall and just wait for all the likes to come in, right? He has arisen to such prominence, you even begin having thoughts about, well, I wonder if our son will leave an indelible mark on human history. I wonder if he will have a legacy that will outlive him into the decades and perhaps even centuries and millennia beyond him because of his contributions to the world and the advancement of civilized society. I have to believe this is exactly how the parents of one Pontius Pilate felt as they watched their son succeed and grow and move into positions of prominence and authority and influence in the first century Roman Empire. We know from the Bible and from other historical documents outside the Bible that Pontius Pilate was indeed a very real person who lived in human history. He's mentioned not only in the scriptures and the Gospels and in the book of Acts, but he's also mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus and by Philo of Alexandria. But there still has been some debate about the historicity of this one Pontius Pilate. Was he a very real person, or was he just simply a fictional character that was developed to put forth the narrative of the Christian church? Well, this debate existed until about 60 years ago. You see, in 1961, in the ancient city of Caesarea, there was an archaeological discovery of a hewn piece of limestone. And on this hewn piece of limestone, there was a Latin inscription upon it. This is the very stone that was discovered in 1961. And here's what the translation of the Latin reads: To the divine Augustus Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated. And this stone was apparently some form of a dedication stone of a structure or a building that Pontius Pilate had built in the city of Caesarea, that outpost of the Roman Empire in the Judean region. And he dedicated it to the Caesar, the emperor at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, Tiberius Caesar. Isn't it amazing how modern day archaeology continues to confirm the validity and the veracity of the Bible? Well, as the prefect or governor over Judea, Pontius Pilate would have several responsibilities in that political office. One, he was the supreme commander and the general over all the military forces of the Roman Empire in that region. All the Roman soldiers stationed throughout that place would be under his command. So, the very Roman cohort of soldiers that was dispatched early that Friday morning to go and arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane were under Pilate's charge and command. But not only was he the military commander of the region for the Roman Empire, as governor, he also had the responsibility for the collection of taxes among the people for the Roman Empire. And so he had to have his hand on economics. He had to have the capacity of administration to organize the taxation of Israel. So he was not only a militarily skilled person, he was also an administrator. But even beyond that, as the governor of the region in the Roman Empire, he was also the final court of appeals. He sat in the highest seat of judicial judgment in the region as the prefect. And so he would preside over cases that came before him that particularly had impact and implications for the Roman government and the Roman Empire. So he's a general, he's an administrator, and he's the supreme judge and final court on behalf of Rome. He's arisen to this position of prominence and pride and power that surely his parents were gushing over all the success he had. But alas, Pontius Pilate is not remembered in the annals of human history for some great military victory. Pontius Pilate is not even remembered for any great contribution to civilized society. Pontius Pilate is remembered 2,000 years later for one thing and one thing alone. He sent an innocent man to his death. That's what he's remembered for. He handed over Jesus to be crucified. And this morning, in our ongoing verse-by-verse study through the Gospel of Luke, we arrive at Luke's account of Pilate's involvement in this ongoing saga. I've said it before, but it bears repeating. Listen, when we study the Bible, we're not studying fiction. These are not myths or fables or legends. This is real events with real people that happened in real history. So let's see Luke, the historian's account of Pilate's involvement, beginning in verse 13. Here's what the Bible says. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." Verse 18, but they all cried out together, "Away with this man and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked. But he delivered Jesus over to their will. I want to remind you where we are in the course of the narrative. I want to remind you what's happened just preceding what we just read about. In the early morning hours of this Good Friday, the dispatched cohort of Roman soldiers, along with temple guards from the temple and the elders and chief priests, came to the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus was praying along with his disciples, and they arrested him. They brought him then to Caiaphas, the high priest's home, where he would be interrogated in the early pre-dawn hours by Caiaphas. They would bring false accusations and false testimonies against Jesus, and then they took him to Annas' home, the former high priest, and really the power behind the office of high priest. And once again, Jesus would be illegally put on trial because according to Jewish law and custom, there could not be a trial of an accused person before the dawn of the light. Well, once light comes, the rooster has crowed, Caiaphas and Annas call a meeting, emergency meeting of the Sanhedrin, the 70 elders who oversaw the people of Israel. And they meet together only for the purpose of putting a rubber stamp on the decision that had already been made by Caiaphas and Annas. And that was to send Jesus to Pilate and demand his execution. So what happens is Pilate questions him, and Pilate, as a matter of due process, examines Jesus and examines the charges they brought against him. You see, here's the trumped up charges that the religious leaders brought against Jesus. They knew that Pilate did not care about any supposed infractions that Jesus may have made against Jewish law. So what did they say? They said, well, he's an insurrectionist. He's mounting a rebellion and a revolt against Rome. He's misleading the city. He's telling people not to pay their taxes. And notice what Pilate said after questioning Jesus the first time, up in chapter 23, verse 4 and 5. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they were urgent, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place. And whenever Pilate heard, oh, he's from Galilee, well, that's Herod's jurisdiction. That's not my jurisdiction. Herod happened to be staying in the palace that his father Herod the Great had built there in Jerusalem. And so Pilate sends him over to Herod's quarters, and he says, hey, you examine him. Well, Jesus wouldn't answer him a word. So Pilate mocks him, he dresses him up, and he sends him back to Pilate, having found no guilt in him either. And now here, the third time, we see that Jesus is before an official of the Roman government, an official of the Roman Empire. And in our focal text, we see the fateful decision that Pontius Pilate has made, the decision for which he is remembered in all of human history. And as we consider this from Luke's account, there are three vitally important truths that I believe Luke wants us to see from his narrative. There are 3 points on your outline. Let's consider them together. The first one is this. Number one, I want us to see the declaration of innocence. The declaration of innocence. You know, Pontius Pilate had one of the most unique opportunities in all of human history. I don't think he fully grasped or understood the opportunity that was before him. But Pilate had a face-to-face conversation with his Creator. Pilate was face-to-face with the very Son of God. I don't think he fully understood the ramifications of all that was going on there. I don't think he fully grasped the weight of that moment. But I do believe he knew there was something different about Jesus. For one, his wife warned him. His wife warned him that she had a dream, a nightmare, to put it better. And she told her husband, Pilate, don't have anything to do with this man. Had he ever been confronted with a person like Jesus before in all of his years of jurisprudence and military leadership and political control? In this interrogation with Jesus, John 19 tells us that he stood before Pilate, Jesus did, silently. Pilate would ask him a question, and Jesus just stare right back, looking him in the eyes, never answering his questions. And so Pilate decides to use the line that he'd used with other unresponsive prisoners before. What does he say? Look at John 19, verse 10. Pilate said to him, you will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? No doubt most prisoners he'd given that line to before would crumble of the weight and cower under that position of authority, but not Jesus. Notice how Jesus responded. He answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above." Jesus finally breaks his silence, and in so doing, in that one sentence, he pushes back all the bravado and power Pilate possessed. I don't think anybody ever said anything to him like that before. I believe the hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he probably thought, "Oh my goodness, my wife is right again." I hate it when that happens. Now, in the passage we'll study next Sunday, we'll see, and it'll be the first of, Lord willing, 3 sermons on the crucifixion of Jesus. Luke has an extended narrative on the cross and what happened at the cross. But before we get to the cross, Luke wants us to understand something that's vital to understanding the work of the cross. And it's this: Jesus is not guilty. Jesus is completely innocent. Already the highest judge in the land, Pilate, has declared he's not guilty. He sends him to Herod. Herod mocks him but sends him back and says, "I don't find any guilt in him either." And here in this passage, not once, not twice, but 3 times, Pilate declares this man is not guilty. In fact, look how Pilate put it at the end of verse 15. At the end of verse 15, he says, "Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him." So he renders his decision. "I will therefore punish and release him." Now, I want you to think for this a second, just as a matter of jurisprudence. If you were standing before a judge and you were charged on particular crimes, and the judge found you not guilty, what if the judge says, "He's not guilty of all the charges against him, so take him out back and give him a good beating before I let him go"? We would think, "Oh, that doesn't seem quite right. I'm not guilty. Why are you going to beat me?" We understand exactly what Pilate's doing here in the Roman law and Roman tradition. The word there for punish is not a word that we would see later for scourging. It's actually the word paiduo, from which we get the English word pedagogy. Pedagogy refers to the instruction of a child. Some of you who are teachers understand pedagogical instruction. To teach a child, to train a child. And so what the Roman tradition would be is if there was a criminal who maybe couldn't be found guilty on particular charges, but maybe was heading in the direction of a particular area of crime, they would do this not punitive punishment, but remedial punishment, this corrective, pedagogy, a type of an instructive punishment. And that's exactly what Pilate intends to do to Jesus. I'm not going to kill him. I'm not going to execute him. He's completely guilty. But I'm going to give him this kind of pedagogy, this punishment, remedial instruction. But to be honest, I don't really think he even was concerned about warning Jesus towards some life of crime. I think he was just trying to find some way to appease the bloodthirsty Jews. Maybe if I whip him, maybe if I just beat him a little bit, maybe that will satisfy their desire. Did it? Did it satisfy the accusers? No, they would not be satisfied. And that leads to the next thing I want you to notice. Not only the declaration of innocence that Luke wants us to see here, but secondly, the demand of crucifixion. The demand of crucifixion. There is a wholesale rejection of Jesus by the religious leaders in Israel. In fact, Luke lists those who are complicit in this rejection. Notice what he says in verse 13. He tells us who Pilate called together for this meeting. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people. And after all these folks were called together, what's their conclusion? "But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed." On 3 occasions, Pilate tried to reason with the rambunctious crowd. And on 3 occasions, the religious leaders and the chief priests and the people shouted him down. Now, I know we in our highly evolved 21st century humanity never shout somebody down whenever they present a reasonable argument. If somebody has a rebuttal or an argument that's contrary to what we think, we surely only just respond in our highly evolved state with another reasonable argument. We don't shout people down we disagree with, right? Of course we do. It's human nature. That's exactly what they did. They didn't have any answer to the fact that Jesus was completely innocent, so what do? They shout him down. But we need to recognize here, and step back a little bit and see the larger perspective of what's going on here. This is not just that the religious leaders are opposing some Galilean rabbi who's preaching a contrary doctrine on the backside of Judea. What's going on here, and what I believe Luke wants us to see, is that this was a wholesale rejection by the Jewish religious leadership of the promised Jewish Messiah. Jesus is the one who has been long promised to come and be the rescuer and the Savior of Israel. And the ones who are the gatekeepers of Judaism, the ones who are supposed to be anticipating and looking for and confirming, yes, this is the Messiah, they reject the very one that they were supposed to be looking for. I believe that's what Luke wants us to understand here, which is precisely why John begins his gospel in the curious way he does. We understand John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But a few verses down, look at verse 9 through 11 of John chapter 1. John writes, "The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and yet the world did not know him." Watch this. "He came to his own," that's his own people, "and his own people did not receive him." And not only did they not receive him, they rejected him. And not only did they reject him, they called for his murder, the one that God had sent to save them. Of course, this is all a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. As Isaiah would say in Isaiah 53:3, he was despised and forsaken of men. And that's exactly what's happening here. He's despised and he's forsaken. And 3 times Pilate tries to placate and appease the crowd, and 3 times they shout him down. Look at these again with me, just so we're aware. Look at the next slide, verse 18. "But they all cried out together, 'Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas.'" Verse 20, Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." And then the next one in verse 22, look what it says. Next slide. "A third time he said to them, 'Why? What evil has he done? I found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him.' But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed." And I believe by Luke recording for us 3 successive attempts by Pilate and 3 times rejected by the religious leaders, Luke is wanting us to recognize the complete and total rejection of the Jewish Messiah, Jesus. But now you may be asking the question that I asked this week as I was studying and preparing for this sermon. The question was, why? I mean, if Pilate is the final authority, if Pilate even has admitted, as we saw in John 19, he alone possesses the authority to release Jesus, and he alone possesses the authority to crucify Jesus. Why, when being so clear about Jesus' innocence, why did he give in to the Jewish people's demands? Why did he cave to their shouts for crucifixion? Well, as I studied and researched this week, I discovered some interesting information historically about the tenuous relationship between one Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, and the religious leaders of the Jews. Pontius Pilate was, as we can tell, either the 6th or 7th prefect over Judea by the Roman Empire. And upon his appointment to that office and that position, he arrived in the region with great pomp and circumstance. He came wanting to make a display of his absolute power and absolute authority, and for everyone to know, I've got the entire power of the Roman Empire behind me. So, as Pilate showed up in Judea on day 1 of his administration, he showed up with a massive entourage of soldiers on horses. And these soldiers on horses had these poles. And on these poles, they had banners that were paying homage to Caesar. And the top of the poles, there was a bust of Tiberius Caesar. Well, if you know anything about Jewish custom and Jewish law, they oppose any graven image that may be construed as an idol. And so as Pilate shows up in Jerusalem to make a show of his power and authority, immediately the religious leaders begin to call for the destruction of all those idols that are on the poles of all the soldiers and their horses. And he says, "No way, Jose." Well, maybe he didn't say that. He said, "I'm not doing it." He said, "I reject your calls." And so they begin to protest and they begin to riot. Well, Pilate eventually goes to the palace in Caesarea, and all these Jewish leaders follow him, shouting him down. His one day on the job. He goes to the palace, and for 5 days they're camped outside his palace, shouting and rioting until he will remove those graven images from his soldiers. Finally, he says, I tell you what, y'all meet me in the amphitheater, and in the amphitheater we'll have a conversation. They think, finally. So they all go to the amphitheater. He enters the amphitheater with all his soldiers, and he surrounds them, and he says, if you guys don't stop harassing me and the rioting, I'm going to kill you all right now. Here's what the Jewish leaders did. They took off their hats, they took off their outer garments, they got down on their knees, and they exposed their neck and say, kill us all. Well, even Pilate couldn't do that, kill innocent people. So what did he do? He relented. And in that moment, he found out who was in power in Israel. And it wasn't him. Next episode that happened with Pilate and the Jewish leaders is there was a palace that was in Jerusalem. I mentioned earlier, it was built by Herod the Great, and Herod Antipas also lived there. Well, when Pilate would stay there, he would decorate it, and again, he would put up banners that hailed Tiberius Caesar as Lord. And guess what? Again, the Jewish leaders opposed it. He said, I'm not taking them down. Well, word gets back to Caesar all the way in Rome because the Jewish people sent a messenger to Caesar. And Caesar sends word back to Pilate, take those banners down. Why? Because the Roman Empire functioned under this principle. It's called Pax Romana in Latin. It means Roman peace. One of the beauties of the Roman Empire was they would placate the regional religious practices of the places they'd conquered and occupied to keep the Pax Romana, to keep the Roman peace. And so he didn't want to do anything to upset that. Another incident that happened, a third one, is that Pilate decided that he wanted to build a new aqueduct feeding Jerusalem, the city, to provide more fresh water to the city. However, to finance this aqueduct, he plundered the treasury of the Jewish temple. Again, an outcry from the Jewish leaders. And so there's this 3 times, 3 strikes and you're out. Well, he's not out yet, but Pilate's on thin ice, right? Pilate has multiple times had these conflicts with the Jewish leadership, and here he's in another tough spot. The Jewish leaders are saying, listen, we want him dead. So what's this about? Why did Pilate cave? I believe largely he caved for self-preservation. If I don't give in to their demands, I'm out of here. Well, just a little history. By 36 AD, he was removed from that post. He went into a self-exile and eventually committed suicide. Just like Judas the betrayer, Pilate went to a path of self-destruction. But that's the human side of the equation. There's a divine side of the equation, right? Pilate caves because of his need for self-preservation, but that's not the divine side. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that one of the most mind-blowing things about the nature and the character and the power of God is how God in his sovereignty takes every single human decision, every free volitional act of your will, he takes those and he weaves them together to accomplish his purpose and his sovereign plan. And that's exactly what happened here. In fact, you move over to Acts chapter 4, and there's a gathering of the early church, and they're praying and they're praising God in their prayers about what happens right here. Look what they prayed in Acts chapter 4, verse 27. They prayed these words together, "For truly in this city, in Jerusalem, there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place." So I want you to know something. The reason Jesus, as a completely innocent prisoner, was sent to his death on the cross at the rejection of the Jews was because of the purpose of salvation of God the Father. He was accomplishing his salvation. It's in perfect keeping with his plan. Why? Why? Well, that leads to the third thing I want us to see this morning. Number 3, I want us to consider the delivered substitution. The delivered substitution. Look again at verse 25. Luke writes, "He released a man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will." I want you to circle the word released and circle the word delivered. Released and delivered. We read that and we think, what a miscarriage of justice. This one who is guilty of insurrection, the one who's guilty of murder, is set free. And the one who is completely innocent is condemned to die. As I thought about it, in our imagination, in our ears, I can just hear the turning of the key on Barabbas' jail cell as they open it up and they say to him, "You're free to go." If I'm Barabbas, I'm not asking any questions. I'm gathering my things and I'm out the door. You know what the name Barabbas means? Bar, which means son of, Abba, Father. Barabbas' name is son of the Father. But the false son of the Father is set free, and the true son of the Father is crucified. And I just think, as he shot out the door, he understood a reality. You see, he had committed crimes, 2, murder and insurrection. The other Gospels tell us he was also a thief, that were guilty of public execution on a cross. And it's highly likely that the very crossbeam that Jesus carried was the crossbeam intended for Barabbas. And others have conjectured that the thieves who hung on the left and the right of that central cross were actually thieves who were a part of Barabbas' band of thieves, because he was a thief as well. And the ringleader of the insurrection and revolt goes free. And I believe this is the central truth of this passage. The guilty goes free, the innocent is killed in his place. The guilty is liberated, and the innocent dies on his cross. And we could take this passage and we could moralize it and we could interpret it and we could apply it. We could say, oh, we need to have a character study here of Pilate. He caved into pressure. Don't cave into pressure. Amen, let's go home. But that's not the central point of the text. The central point of the text is an innocent man died for a guilty man. An innocent man was the substitute for him who is guilty. That's the focus. Point 1, Jesus is completely innocent, declared 3 times. Point 2, Jesus is totally rejected by the very ones who should have received him, declared 3 times. And point 3, Jesus died in the place of the guilty and the condemned. And this substitutionary death in the place of the condemned is nothing less than God's plan of salvation. God's purpose of redemption. That's the significance of this passage before us. It illustrates in real flesh and blood the theological truth that Paul declared in 2 Corinthians 5:21, where he said, "For our sake, he," that's God the Father, "made him," that's God the Son, "to be sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Jesus was not dying for his own crimes. He was dying for the crimes of another. Jesus was not dying for his own sins. He was dying for the sins of another. And I just have to wonder, as I kind of trace this rabbit trail in my mind this week, I had to wonder, as Barabbas, son of the Father, was set free, as he was one who was under the conviction of 2 capital cases of insurrection and murder, doubly dead, as he is now walking around scot-free, I just had to wonder and imagine, I wonder if he happened to walk and meander down the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. I just have to wonder if he walked towards the place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. And I just have to wonder if he looked on that picture that was there before him as he sees 2 of his comrades hanging there dying, and in the middle, Jesus, the innocent one, dying in his place. We won't know till heaven, but perhaps with absolute clarity, he understood, I'm the guilty one. I should be there. That's my cross. Look once more at verse 25. Such powerful truth. It says, he, Pilate, released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. Released and delivered. Barabbas is released. Jesus is delivered. The guilty one is released and set free. The innocent one is delivered over to the cross. But here's the deal. Jesus didn't just die as a substitute for Barabbas. He died as a substitute for you. He died in your place. And if you look to the cross, if you see the innocent one hanging there in your place as your substitute, and if you trust his death as an atonement for your sins, listen, there is a beautiful release and deliverance that happens. You will have been released from the domain of darkness and delivered over to the kingdom of his beloved Son. You have been released from the punishment of eternity in hell and delivered over to the glories of eternity in heaven. You'll be released from the presence and the power of sin and delivered over to the very power of the Holy Spirit controlling and ruling your life. You'll be released from the sentence of death and released and delivered over to the sentence of life. And you will be released, listen, from guilt and condemnation and delivered over to forgiveness from God the Father. And you will be released from the bonds of spiritual imprisonment and delivered over to the freedom that only comes through knowing Christ. Released and delivered because of the substitution of Jesus. Oh, what glorious grace. What glorious grace. And friends, the reason we preach this every week, the reason we communicate the glories of the cross every single week is because not only is it vital for the salvation of sinners, understanding the work of Jesus on the cross is vital for the sanctification of the saints. Unless you understand the gospel, unless you revel in the work of Christ, you will not grow in your assurance of salvation. You will not grow in your victory over the evil one. You will not grow in your confidence in this world. You know, in this room, there are many people, and I believe even today, who are struggling with acceptance. We hear people talk about it. We hear people say, I just don't feel accepted. I don't sense this acceptance. And we need to understand the issue of acceptance is a huge issue. But what you do does not have any basis on you being accepted by God. You being accepted by God is not determined by your GPA. You being accepted by God is not count by your credit score or how many degrees you have after your name. Being accepted by God is completely based solely upon the merit of Christ and his work on the cross in your place. And so if you're struggling with acceptance, no, even though you're going to mess up and mess up again, listen, Jesus' death on the cross died for the mess ups in the past, the mess ups in the present, and all the mess ups you're going to have in the future. You're fully accepted in the beloved. And it makes all the difference in the world to how we live our lives, to walk in this glorious truth. So many who struggle with acceptance, with confidence, with victory, with assurance, need to just rest in the finished work of Jesus on the cross. He's your substitute so that you might be accepted by God in him. And because of that grace, you've been released and you've been delivered. What a beautiful thing we see even in this miscarriage of justice carried out by one Pontius Pilate. And that leads to my last thought. Our acceptance by God is not based on personal performance, but on undeserved grace.